another way to be thinking about metabolic health is to think about the typical progression of dysfunction that we usually see, which is swinging towards the side of overnourishment or over-consuming calories for what we're actually demanding from the body. And that kind of starts the path of what we know as eventually insulin resistance and then type 2 diabetes, kind of that overnourishment side of the equation. So if somebody is not tracking their food at all, and we probably can deduce that they're probably on that side of the spectrum, I guess this might be a good time to jump into like biomarkers. So how do we know if they're kind of sliding down that spectrum towards insulin resistance?
So there's a simple calculation, a formula, the HOMA-IR score, that's been used for a long time now, that just really is a matter of fasting insulin, fasting glucose, and a couple of additional constants that get thrown in there. So that gives you, again, a rough sense. You can also kind of get to see, do they look like they have excess visceral fat, like a metabolic associated fatty liver issue going on, whether via that's through an ultrasound with FibroScan, or if that's through liver enzymes that remain slightly elevated. But again, there can be a lot of other reasons for liver enzymes to be elevated, so you need to be careful about that one. I think looking at their triglyceride levels and saying, it's a fasted specimen, your triglyceride to HDL ratio is high, so we're probably thinking that's related to poor cellular metabolism and inefficient breakdown of certain fuel sources. And so those are some basic ways to start looking at it.
So if somebody is overeating and underburning the energy that they're eating from their diet, that will, the way that I understand it, the kind of the root cause of insulin resistance is when you're in this imbalance of over-consuming food, you develop that, the body has to store the energy somewhere, right? So the preferred method is going to store it in the subcutaneous fat, which is the fat that we can pinch. But if we kind of run out of room there, depending sometimes on your body and your genetics, you'll have this spillover of fat into the visceral fat. And it's actually the accumulation of that fat between the organs and within the organs, like in the muscle, that starts to contribute to insulin resistance. Because our body wants to burn sugar. That's the preferred fuel source. And when there is intramuscle fat buildup, that's where insulin has a hard time taking that sugar out of the blood and putting it where it needs to go, either into the muscle or into the fat to be stored. You think that's pretty comprehensive of what insulin resistance is? Would you add anything to that? And then I want to bring it back to the biomarkers.
No, I think that's a pretty good summation of several things, and the importance that you kind of alluded to of passive glucose transport, right, through muscle, more muscle tissue, more GLUT4 transport kind of helps you manage blood sugar a little bit better. I think that it can get a little bit challenging in some cases, because what really is that factor that's leading to more shifting around the deposition of fat to the visceral tissue? Like, where is that trigger? Is it an inflammatory trigger? Like, what is the signaling pathway that leads to that? Growth
so inflammation.
Hormone, I don't think it's very clear.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I've just heard it described as kind of like a spillover. Once at some point, whether it's environmental triggers, genetics, inflammation, like you mentioned, the body just starts to trigger that visceral fat accumulation, which is why you can have people that aren't even necessarily overweight, and still have insulin resistance. I think it's a third of people that kind of qualify for metabolic dysfunction don't qualify as being overweight. So going back to the biomarkers, typically what I'm looking at on a panel is fasting glucose, triglycerides, and kind of taking into account the trigs HDL ratio, A1C, and fasting insulin. And the typical progression for insulin resistance is, if you can challenge the system with food, the earliest biomarker we could catch is actually a post-eating higher insulin level. The body has to make more insulin to overcome the resistance. The second thing you'll typically see from a biomarker perspective, if we're measuring it, is post-food higher glucose levels. Then you'll start to see some deviations on fasting blood work. So that's one of the things I try to emphasize to people is by the time you're fasting insulin and glucose and A1C are off, we're 4, 5, 6 steps into the dysfunction process, right?